Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 3rd of February 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
Dear students, Rouse IAS has launched its essay, mains test series and quality improvement program for 2021. Now we are all aware of the fact that essay as a paper has emerged as the rank maker in this entire scheme of things from the perspective of mains examination. And all those who score top ranks do very well in the essay paper. We also know that people pay attention to mains test series in terms of general studies paper, but they hardly pay any attention to the essay paper. Keeping this in mind, Rouse IAS has launched essay, mains test series and quality improvement program for 2021. The course features are as follows. First and foremost, there will be quality improvement program classes, which will be live and interactive classes. These will constitute of around 30 hours of essay writing approach and skills, and video backup for the classes will be available for 7 days. Apart from that, there will be an essay compass booklet, which will be a compilation of essays from previous year topics. Second important aspect is the test itself. Now in this program, there will be tests which will be divided into thematic test and full length test. So there will be 3 thematic tests and 3 full length tests in order to help you prepare for the examination in the right format. Any system of learn and test can thrive only when the review mechanism is proper. And for this particular purpose, we'll be sharing with you sample essays. There will be test discussion classes for which video backup will be available till mains 2021. Apart from that, there will be evaluation and personal mentorship available for this particular course. So what are you waiting for? You should enroll yourself in the course, as the course is starting on 8th of February 2021. For more details, visit rouseias.com website or call us.
So we'll start today's discussion with an editorial. It's Goodbye to Fiscal Orthodoxy, which has been written by Mr. T.T. Ram Mohan, who is a professor at IIM Ahmedabad. And so talking about yesterday's budget, he says that the approach of Modi government is spend like there is no tomorrow. Because, of course, in yesterday's budget, the government has estimated that the fiscal deficit of the coming year is going to be around 10% or 9.5% of the GDP, which is a massive jump. And so that is why he says it is a goodbye to fiscal orthodoxy. And apart from that, he uses a lot of terms. For example, fiscal conservatism, fiscal consolidation, FRBM Act, and he also talks about Washington Consensus. For most of the aspirants who are in their initial stages of preparation, these can be very baffling terms. And so what we are going to do is that first we'll understand the meaning of these terms, and then we will very briefly talk about what this author has to say or what are the issues according to him as far as this particular budget is concerned. So let us start by first understanding the fiscal conservatism. So if we talk about government's budgeting, we know that government has a lot of sources of revenues, for example, taxes and cesses. And at the same time, government has to spend a lot of money on various issues from defense to social services. And just like any household, even the government has to balance these revenues with that of its expenditures. When expenditure is higher, of course, government has to borrow that extra amount in order to do that spending. And so the difference between the total revenue and total expenditure of the government is termed as fiscal deficit. Of course, this is a very broad definition and there are a lot of nuances into it. But broadly speaking, fiscal deficit is the difference between total revenue and total expenditure of the government. And so it is an indication of total borrowing needed by the government. Now, borrowing means taking loans, and just like when households take loans, they have to pay interest. If the government borrows this amount in order to meet its expenditures, the government will have to pay massive amounts of interest on that. And just like household, that will be paid for 10, 20, 30 years. And so, fiscal conservatism as economic philosophy talks about prudence in government spending and debt creation. Now, prudence means cautious. So fiscal conservatism says that government should be very prudent in spending money, and the government should avoid any kind of deficit spending. Deficit spending means that the government is overshooting its revenue to spend money in order to create fiscal deficit and then borrowing the money to meet that deficit. And so fiscal conservatism talks about fiscal consolidation, which is a reduction in overall government spending as well as national debt, and hence ensuring a very balanced budgets. And so let us understand what are the ways in which a government can reduce its fiscal deficit, or basically, if you break it down, what are the ways in which the government can increase its revenue and reduce its spending. And that is the only way to reduce the fiscal deficit. So one way to do that would be to better the targeting of government subsidies. For example, by extending direct benefit transfer scheme for more subsidies, so that leakages can be plugged and corruption can be reduced, so that each and every penny or paise of government spending goes to the intended beneficiary. Then, as far as tax is concerned, government can improve efficiency of tax administration. And so there are a lot of ways to do that. One of the ways is to eliminate the tax evasion. Then the government can take measures to increase the tax compliance and at the same time reduce tax avoidance. So all these three measures will improve the efficiency of tax administration so that the revenues become higher. At the same time, government can also take measures to enhance taxes to GDP ratio. Now, as far as enhancing tax to GDP ratio is concerned, there are two ways to do it. One of them is to widen the tax base so that more and more people come under the tax net. And the second is to minimize tax concessions and exemptions given to various sectors, which also improves tax revenues. Then, of course, higher economic growth rate will help the government to get higher tax revenues as well. So these are the measures through which consolidation can be done. Now the question arises that whether India has so far followed fiscal conservatism and fiscal consolidation or not. And the answer is yes. Because India has passed Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003, which sets target for the government of India to establish fiscal or financial discipline, improve the management of public funds, and strengthen fiscal prudence and reduce its fiscal deficit. So whatever we have talked about in this section is done through this act, which did not exist before 2003, and the government could spend as much amount as it wanted whenever it wanted. But in 2003, the government of India came up with this act and made it an obligation of the government to follow the targets which have been set by this particular act and gradually reduce the fiscal deficit in a time-bound manner. So of course the government was not able to meet the targets set out in 2003, and so this particular act has been amended a lot of times to delay the achievement of these targets. And so the most recent set of targets are that government has to gradually reduce the fiscal deficit so that by 2022 and 2023 it achieves the fiscal deficit of 2.5% with revenue deficit of 0.8% and overall debt of the central government at 38.7%. And these were after the recommendations of NK Singh committee. And you can see that government has been very seriously pursuing these targets. If you look, there is a trend of gradual reduction in the fiscal deficit from 4.9, 5.9% in 2012-13 to 3.4% in 2019 and 20. And if COVID had not happened in 2020, this path would have surely continued. And now what the author says is that when the government projects in 2020 and 21, the fiscal deficit to be at the level never seen before at around 10%, this is a cause of concern. And this is a cause of concern because apart from setting the targets, FRBM Act also mandates the government to come up with 3 sets of documents: Fiscal Policy Strategy Statement, Medium-Term Fiscal Policy Statements, and Macroeconomic Framework Statement. Now, among all these 3, this document in the red color, which is Medium-Term Fiscal Policy Statement, is the one which lays down the strategy of the government in the medium term, which is in 3 to 5 years, as to how it is going to reduce the fiscal deficit. And according to the author, if you read this document, the statements about how India is going to reduce the fiscal deficit in medium term, how it is going to be on track as far as fiscal consolidation is concerned, all these things are missing from this document. So the government has very conveniently increased the fiscal deficit and it is about to amend the FRBM Act, but there is no clarity as to how it is going to reduce the fiscal deficit in 5 to 10 years down the line. And so according to the author, there are four major concerns with such a massive amount of fiscal deficit which will be created in coming 2 to 3 years. And the first one deals with Washington Consensus. So Washington Consensus refers to a set of free market economic policies supported by prominent financial institutions such as IMF and World Bank, and also the developed countries like USA and the European Union. And there are 10 very specific principles which has to be followed if you abide by the Washington Consensus. And one of them is low government borrowing. And the idea is to discourage developing economies from having high fiscal deficits relative to their GDP. And so according to author, this particular budget is departure from Washington Consensus. Now why is this a problem? Now this is a problem because not just global institutions like IMF and World Bank keep the track of countries whether they are following these Washington Consensus or not, but also because the credit rating agencies also keep a track of countries whether they are following Washington Consensus path or not. And if India has openly decided to break the path to fiscal consolidation, it is going to be problematic to deal with these agencies. Then author raises question which was already discussed in our DNS January when economic survey was discussed, where the economic survey says that whatever debt you create becomes sustainable if you have high growth rate. Because the idea is that COVID-19 and the expenditures which this particular pandemic has brought requires fiscal spending, which will of course require massive levels of debt creation. Because Government of India will have to take a lot of loan. But the economic survey says that if interest paid by Indian government is less than India's growth rate, there is no problem. Because if the growth rate is higher than the interest rate, of course India can easily pay back this loan. And so if government borrows rupees 100 and invests it, and if the same amount of investment in the second year yields 112 rupees, and let's say if the interest on that amount is 8 rupees, government has to pay back 108 rupees, then also the net addition to economy is rupees 4. Now here is a problem. In the past, India has never grown at the rate of 10 to 12% per annum. Although it can grow this year because of the low base effect, because overall economy contracted, and so in 2021 and 22 you might have growth rate of more than 15%, but that will not be sustainable, and so whatever debt we are creating might not be sustainable in medium to long term. Then according to the author, another concern is that a large fiscal deficit can fuel a rise in inflation. It is more than likely that a change in the fiscal consolidation targets will require a change in the inflation target of 4% set for RBI itself. And budget makes no mention of such a possibility, and so according to the author, the government has not kept inflation in mind when deciding massive fiscal deficit this particular year. And then final is that the government has set up very large disinvestment targets, which is the sale of public assets. And government wants to earn a lot of money by diluting its stake in publicly owned or public sector undertakings. But this is a very high risk strategy. Because for years now, revenue from disinvestment have fallen short of targets always. If you look in past 3 to 4 years, whatever targets the government has set to be earned from disinvestment of public sector undertakings, they have always fallen short. And so, according to the author, whatever government expects from disinvestment targets might not be met, and so even the 9.5% of fiscal deficit is an understatement and it is likely to go much higher. So this overall discussion is very important from the perspective of prelims examination because these concepts can be directly asked there, although the issues with respect to the budget might not be that relevant. Let us now move on to the next discussion. So the next topic of discussion is a very important one from the perspective of international relations under GS2. So on 1st of February, Myanmar's military has staged a coup, arresting civilian leaders, shutting off the internet and cutting off flights. And realizing Myanmar's importance in India's international relations, it has been given wide coverage in the Hindu newspaper today. Setback in Myanmar appears on page number 6. Booting out partial democracy appears on page number 7. Myanmar's generals tighten control after seizing power appears on page number 13. Why did the military stage a coup appears on page number 13. And finally on the same page we have China calls for all parties to safeguard Myanmar's stability. Being a UPSC aspirant, we cannot be clueless about what's happening in the neighboring countries, just like this girl was, who was doing her regular aerobics classes out in open without realizing that a military coup was taking place right behind her. Therefore, we are going to start the discussion by first understanding what is the overall importance of Myanmar in Indian context. Then we are going to understand the historical perspective as to how this problem has a roots in recent history as well. And then finally we are going to understand what should be India's policy towards this evolving situation in Myanmar. The relation or the bilateral relation of India with its neighbors are very, very important. And Myanmar being one of the very important neighbors, although not very significant and active player in India's foreign policy, but nonetheless is important. It's important mainly because of two reasons. First is that Myanmar, which in the map is located towards the eastern side of India's northeast, is the link to the ASEAN countries. ASEAN, which is the future of the global economy. We want to connect to ASEAN, and for that, for the land connectivity, Myanmar is the only option for us. We know that Myanmar itself is a member of ASEAN. It's an ASEAN nation. It's also a member of BIMSTEC, and so you can say that Myanmar is the common link between the South Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries. The second important reason why Myanmar is so significant is because of our northeast. We know that through land borders we connect to the northeast via Chicken's Neck. It's not only very narrow, but it is also very vulnerable because of the Chinese threats. And so we always want to create multiple ways to reach to our northeast. And one of the ways is, of course, Bangladesh, and another way is through Myanmar. Reaching Myanmar through Bay of Bengal and then taking the land or the river route into our northeast. Not only that, people settled along the borders of India and Myanmar share common cultural links. And so, if we can somehow connect both sides of the people through economy, it will lead to a multiplier effect in the northeast. So now, since we have clearly established the significance of Myanmar in India's overall scheme of things, let us now quickly go over to the historical perspective so that you are in a better position to appreciate what has happened day before yesterday. So since 1990s, Myanmar was in the military control. But in 2008, Constitution obviously was drafted by military, people who were actually controlling the political affairs of the country. And so in the Constitution, they inserted a lot of conditions, and the conditions were such so as to make it impossible for Miss Aung San Suu Kyi to become president. Because the first condition was that to become a president of Myanmar, you must have military experience. That is the first condition. Then the second condition was that the family members of the president, including the president, must be Myanmarese citizens. Now we know that Miss Suu Kyi's sons have British nationality. So on both these counts, she was debarred to become president. Apart from that, there were three conditions put in the constitution itself which would ensure the perpetual control of military junta over internal and external affairs of the Myanmar. For example, in the constitution of Myanmar, it is written that the Ministry of Defense and Interior Ministry, which is like Home Ministry, will be controlled by military, and 25% of the total seats in parliament shall be reserved for military people. So military retained the control of internal affairs as well as the borders, and it also through this amendment ensured that whatever political decisions are taken inside the parliament, military will have a say on that. And so the first elections were conducted in 2010 under the changed constitution. And so the party which is most liked by the people, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, which is National League for Democracy, was not recognized, and so it boycotted the elections. Then in 2015, due to increasing international criticism and domestic pressure, most of the political prisoners belonging to National League for Democracy, including Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi herself, were released. Elections were conducted and her party came up with thumping majority. Then in 2020, next elections were conducted where her party secured 396 seats, enough to give her clear majority. But since the results of these elections have been declared, the army is not at peace. According to army, there were terrible frauds in the voter list in parliamentary elections held in November 2020, and the election commission failed to settle the matter. Claiming that this development would seriously impinge the path to democracy, the army declared an emergency, transferring all the powers to commander-in-chief himself. And finally, day before yesterday, all the power has been grasped by the military junta. Now, in this respect, the comments from India have been very measured. India has expressed deep concern over the reports of an unfolding military coup in Myanmar and has also stressed that rule of law and the democratic process must be upheld. But unlike in the past, because the last time when the coup happened in late 1980s, India's response was very fierce. But that has changed, and that has changed keeping in mind India's national interest. Because India has adopted a particular policy towards Myanmar. And let us now discuss that. And so India's policy towards Myanmar is first and foremost characterized by non-interference in Myanmar's internal matters. Myanmar has been making news since last 20 to 30 years because of the dictatorship of the army there. Although India has supported democratization of Myanmar since 1990s, but India always wants that change to come from inside, driven from within the country. Now this has allowed Delhi to engage with the military of Myanmar as well as whichever party backed by the military is in power there. The second important aspect of India's policy towards Myanmar is that India wants engagement to supersede the criticism. India, of course, realizes the problems which Myanmar has created. For example, for India as well, the Rohingya crisis, which has led to the deluge of refugees inside India as well as in Bangladesh. But instead of criticism, India relies more on engagement with Myanmar to somehow resolve this problem so that the repatriation of these Rohingya refugees can be carried on. But other countries have resorted to criticism, but India has chosen engagement. Now we are aware of the increasing influence of China in the Indian subcontinent, and of course Myanmar is no exception, and not many countries have set up their embassies and offices in Myanmar, but China was the first one. And so Myanmar's growing closeness with China and the recent proposal of China-Myanmar economic corridor is a cause of concern for India. And so India wants to counter the increasing Chinese influence in Myanmar through increasing engagement. And so one of the pillars of or the motivations behind India's policy towards Myanmar is to counter the increasing Chinese influence. Of course, there are some problems with respect to the implementations of the projects on ground on which we are outpaced by China always, but India has tried to manage that. Then India has based its engagement with Myanmar on strategic infrastructural development, be it the proposal to build a petroleum refinery in Myanmar that would involve an investment of around $6 billion, or the commitment to operationalize crucial Sitwe port in Myanmar's Rakhine state, or be it India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway as well as Kaladan multimodal transport project. So all these are India's commitment towards infrastructural development in Myanmar. Of course, some of them are for the India's own benefit. For example, the Kaladan multimodal project, which will be a connectivity project which will involve, of course, Sitwe port development and then utilization of Kaladan river going up to Paletwa and then finally taking the highway to the Mizoram border. So that way we are trying to reach Mizoram by taking help of Myanmar, and of course Myanmar is supporting us in that. And then the issue of border management confronts both these nations. There are insurgent movements going on which are troublemakers for both India as well as Myanmar, and hence there is a lot of scope in border security and development cooperation. And that is why India's response has been particularly measured when it comes to military coup in Myanmar, because we need the continued support of Myanmar not only to solve our internal issues challenges but also to counter the increasing impact and influence of China in South Asian region. The next news which we have taken up is an editorial on page number 7 on the alert always, which has been written by MP Nathaniel, who is a retired Inspector General of Police. And so when he talks about India's internal security challenges, we listen. So we all know how an assistant commandant of Cobra, which is Commando Battalion for Resolute Action, was killed in action due to an improvised explosive device planted by Maoists. And all this happened during an anti-Maoist operation. And so in this regard, The author has talked about some of the measures which the government can take and must take with respect to increasing facilities as far as the placement and the deployment of these CRPF battalions in hardcore Naxalite hit areas is concerned. Now, if you have a look at GS3 syllabus, under it, there is a line which says linkages between development and spread of extremism. Now, the matters related to law and order and internal security are looked after by Ministry of Home Affairs, and it publishes an annual report every year. And this is a screenshot from the 2019, which is the latest report of MHA. And let us just look at the first paragraph of the report. It says, internal security issues in the country can broadly be categorized as follows: terrorism in the hinterland of the country, left-wing extremism in certain areas, security situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and insurgency in the northeastern states. So when UPSC expects you to be aware about the internal security challenges, these are the 4 internal security challenges which you should prepare for the mains examination. And of course, left-wing extremism appears prominently over there. UPSC has asked question both in 2015 as well as in 2018. In 2015, UPSC had asked, the persisting drives of the government for development of large industries in backward areas have resulted in isolating the tribal population and the farmers who face multiple displacements with Malkangiri and Naxalbari foci. Discuss the corrective strategies needed to win the left-wing extremism doctrine affected citizens back into the mainstream of social and economic growth. In 2018, UPSC asked, left-wing extremism is showing a downward trend, but still affects many parts of the country. Briefly explain the Government of India's approach to counter the challenges posed by LWE. And so, keeping in mind these past year question paper as well as the syllabus, we are going to first understand what Naxalism actually is, what is its ideology, how due to the government deficit, due to various issues related to the constitutional and legal measures, it spread in so many states and districts in our country. And finally, since last 10 years, we are seeing a decline or a downfall in left-wing extremism threat. And so what government has done right in order to achieve this reduction in Naxalite activity in the central regions of our country. So let us now begin the discussion. Starting with understanding what Naxalism actually is. So Naxalism is a far left violent movement which aims to overthrow the government of India through people's war. So it basically wants to replace the Indian state through a violent and a guerrilla movement. According to the recent MHA release, it is currently impacting more than 80 districts scattered around 11 states in our country. So you can easily understand how widespread the spread of Naxalism is. Although it has decreased through time, but it is still prevalent in many areas. If we talk about Naxalism, from where does this word comes from? It comes from a village known by the name of Naxalbari in Darjeeling district of West Bengal. Because this whole movement is derived from there. Because in 1967, peasant revolt against landlords in Naxalbari village in Darjeeling district of West Bengal went out of control and police opened fire on them. And there began this violent movement, which actually claims to base its ideology on 3 important people. First is Marx and Engels, and the second is Mao Zedong. Now, if we talk about left or far left movement, most of them derive their ideology from the same set of people, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So what was their actual ideology? So according to them, all social relations and state structures in an elitist or a capitalist society are quite exploitative in nature. And since they are exploitative in nature, they need to be replaced. And so according to Naxals, the current Indian state is based on similar capitalistic or semi-feudal setup. And so it needs to be replaced. But there are various ways of replacing a government or a state, but they talk about a revolution. Only a revolution can change this exploitative setup. And so, whoever bases his or her ideology on Marx believes that only a revolutionary change through active means can end this. And that means is provided by Mao Zedong, who led the revolution of Communist Party in China, because he gave the concept of guerrilla warfare, protracted people's war, a war led by the common people against the state, the war not in democratic sense, but war which is violent in nature, which includes surrounding the cities from countryside, political transformation through mass involvement, and finally, through these measures, overthrow the state. And so Naxalites base their ideology on these 2 things. And so, whenever you read news articles related to some Naxalite activity, they basically deal with attack on prominent political leaders, paramilitary forces, and police personnel because they want to overthrow the Indian state. But what is the reality of Naxalites? If you look at their overall activity, it seems to be that they are working against the interests of the people they claim to defend. They want to perpetuate their power in jungles through fear psychosis. They attack civilians and personnel from CAPF or Central Armed Police Forces. They carry out regular extortions, not just from the local people but also from industrialists. So, although they claim to base their ideology on Marx and against capitalism, but they let the industries thrive as long as they agree to pay protection or extortion money. And so the question arises that under the constitutional and legal framework of India, which is considered to be one of the most democratic setup, how come an ideology like Naxalite not only emerged but spread into such a vast territory in our country, as you can see on the diagram in front of your screen? At its peak, it impacted so many districts and states in our country. An answer to that lies in government deficit. The inability or inefficiency of the government to cater to the needs and demands of the people, especially the tribal people, created a fertile ground for this kind of ideology, which ultimately engulfed a major region in our central parts of country. And let us understand those reasons one by one. But basically, they can be categorized into four main reasons. Starting with lack of proper land reforms, lack of proper implementation of the provisions provided in the 5th schedule of our constitution, lack of forest rights being given to the tribal people, and atrocities being committed against people belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Let us discuss them one by one. We know that the Constitution of India has created the provisions of the 5th schedule, which provide for alternate or special governance mechanism for certain scheduled areas in the mainland of our country. And in the 5th schedule, various special provisions have been provided for these specified scheduled areas, which among various other things include the constitution of Tribal Advisory Council in the states. And it also provides for some special powers being given to governor with respect to the legislations. Now, this provision was created in order to protect the tribals in various states. But what has happened? What has happened is that there is a widespread nepotism in the way tribal advisory councils have been constituted. Although initially it was expected that for formulating any policies with respect to the tribals, the advice of tribal advisory council shall be taken. But what happens is that since the influence of council of ministers is so immense that it creates problem at governor and tribal advisory council interface. And more often than not, the Tribal Advisory Council, when it is constituted, it is not a true representative of the tribal population of the state. And apart from that, there is a lack of clarity over the discretionary power of the governor. We know that according to the Constitution of India, the governor is to act on aid and advice of Council of Minister. But according to the provisions of the 5th schedule, governor can act on its own when it comes to the matters related to the scheduled areas. And so this has led to a lot of confusion, and in essence, the true purpose for which the provisions of the 5th schedule were constituted have not been realized. Then comes the matter of forest rights. We know that most of the tribals in our country reside in forested regions. And it is one of the main reasons for the spread of Naxalism as well. Because since the time of the Britishers, we have started to encroach on forested areas. It started with the British government. The monopolization of forests started with the enactment of various forest laws enacted in order to protect the forest. But in the process, we forgot that forest does not just includes the trees and the animals, but also includes people. And since the protection of environment and nature took precedence over the development of the people, there was no Forest Right Acts until 2006, when the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006 was legislated. And through this act, the rights of forest dwelling tribal communities and other traditional forest dwellers to forest resources and their rights were recognized for the first time. It was recognized that these communities live on forest, depend on forest, and it is very, very important to give them rights inside their own forests. But if you look at the provisions of FRA 2006, individual right status is decent, but there is minimal community rights, or community rights are not given. There is so much of insistence on evidence. For example, every tribal has to prove through an evidence that they are living in this forest traditionally, and only then their rights will be recognized. And we know that since time immemorial, they have been functioning outside the system which we have created ourselves. And so there is a lack of evidence which ultimately results in the delay or lack of recognition of the rights provided in Forest Right Act 2006, which ultimately brews the frustration. Then there are atrocities being committed on scheduled caste and scheduled tribal people. We know that there is an act known by the name of Prevention of Atrocities Against SC and ST Act, but it was again legislated in 1989, but by then this problem had already grown. But even if you look at the implementation of this particular act, it lies in the hand of police officials, which again harbor caste prejudices. Ultimately, people sitting in most powerful positions in the bureaucracy and police also have the same caste biases which this particular act tries to fight. And so, the implementation of this particular act, especially in forested regions, has not been great. And then finally, the lack of land reforms. We know that widespread land reforms were carried out after independence, and it has carried on in some states or the other since then. But the land reforms were successful only in few states, for example in Jammu and Kashmir, Kerala and West Bengal. And due to the lack of the political will, most of the steps categorized under land reforms were either not implemented, or if they were implemented, they were not efficient or effective. And so that left the Indian society, especially in these regions, with a lot of landless people. So they don't have their own forests, they don't have land outside the forest, and so it became quite a fertile ground for an extremist ideology like Naxalism. So what is the current status of left-wing extremism and the activities related to it? So if you look at the data from 2001 to 2018, you can see that there is a persistent decline in the left-wing extremism incidents, which means the attacks being carried out by the Naxalites. As compared to more than 2200 incidents in 2010, it has come down to less than 800 cases in 2018. And this is the data given on the Ministry of Home Affairs. And so it clearly shows that there is some traction to the policies and the strategies being followed by the state governments and also the central governments. So all the states affected by LWE have taken their particular measures to suit their local requirements. But in this particular discussion, we are just going to discuss the approach of the central government and the steps taken by them. At the same time, it is important for you to understand that police and public order being the state subject, action with respect to maintenance of law and order lies primarily in the domain of the concerned state governments. Therefore, the policy of the government of India is to effectively deal with the LWE insurgency primarily by capacity building of the state governments, both in areas of security and development. So there is a clear-cut demarcation of the policy. The central government helps various state governments as far as security measures is concerned, and then it also helps the state governments in developing the areas on high priority which are impacted with LWE. So you can see that this is quite a holistic approach. And let us start by first understanding the security measures. First and foremost, outlawing the CPI Maoist, which is the major left-wing extremist organization responsible for most incidents of violence and casualties. And it has been included in the schedule of terrorist organization along with all its formations and front organization under the existing Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 or UAPA. Then government is taking active measures to strengthen the intelligence mechanism because central government cannot directly police the areas, but it can provide the intelligence inputs to the states. And so in order to counter the growing challenge of LWE activities, several steps have been taken to strengthen and upgrade the capabilities of intelligence agencies both at the center as well as the state level. This includes intelligence sharing through multi-agency center MAC at the central level and state multi-agency center at the state level 24/7 basis. These centers enable state and all India level coordination among various agencies involved in countering the LWE. Other steps which have been taken to strengthen the intelligence mechanism include setting up of joint command and control center at Gaya and at Jagdalpur, which will act as nodal centers to coordinate operation against the CPIM or Naxalites. Then we know that Naxalites take special advantage of the fact that there are limitations in front of the state police. And as soon as you cross the border from one state to another and then from that state to another, you can easily evade the action. And so that is why interstate coordination is a must if you counter LWEs. If you look at the border areas of Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Telangana, which is quite a hotbed for Naxalite activities, this is the main reason. Not only these areas are densely forested, but they also belong to different jurisdictions. And you know that police of one state cannot automatically pursue a criminal in another. And so, taking advantage of this fact, they keep on moving from one state to another. And for this, Ministry of Home Affairs keeps on conducting regular and frequent interstate meetings of not only bureaucrats, police officials, but also the Chief Minister for enabling a better response to LWE. Then we know that majority of casualties to security forces in anti-LWE operations are caused by IEDs or improvised explosive device. The Ministry of Home Affairs continues to support extensive counter-IED capacity building efforts of state police forces to enable them to timely identify the IEDs and defuse them. And for this purpose, regular training programs are conducted by MHA. Then MHA has created India Reserve or Specialized Indian Reserve Battalion, acronymed as SIRB. The LWE affected states have been sanctions India Reserve Battalions mainly to strengthen security apparatus at their level and also to enable the states to provide gainful employment to youth, particularly in LWE affected areas. Then there are numerous schemes run by MHA which directly provide advantage to the local police. For example, sanctioning of funds for fortified police stations under the scheme of the same name and carrying out of Civic Action Program or CAP, under which financial grants are provided to CAPFs to undertake various welfare activities in LWE affected areas. And the idea is that CRPF will go to an area, cleanse it from Maoists, keep it free from Maoists, and then develop that area using the same funds. So these are the measures dealing with the security issue. But if we don't develop these areas, these gains will be temporary. And to make these gains permanent, there is a need to develop them as well. And for that also, a lot of schemes are carried out. But in this case, not all schemes are carried out by Ministry of Home Affairs. Now, in the beginning, we discussed how the acts dealing with the conservation of the forest and the nature created the main problem. And so, the Regulation of Forest Conservation Act 1980 have been eased in these areas. And now, it is allowed to divert the forest land for infrastructure creation dealing with the activities mentioned in the schedule. For example, construction of schools, colleges, telecommunication lines, drinking water projects, irrigation projects, creation of roads. For all these activities, the limits up to which a forest land can be diverted has been increased drastically to enable the development of these regions. Then, lack of connectivity is the major tool in the hands of Naxalites. They first disconnect the local population from the mainland and then they carry out their brainwashing. And so connectivity has been a major plank of the government of India. And the connectivity does not mean road connectivity only, but it also means communications connectivity. And so the government of India has been implementing road requirement plan and road connectivity project for LWE areas. Also, installation of mobile towers has been on high priority of the government in these regions. Then we talked about how the lack of implementation of the provisions of the Forest Rights Act has created a lot of trouble in these regions. Now, government is keeping the timely distribution of the titles or the land titles to the tribals on high priority in LWE areas. According to the recent data by MHA, around 15 lakh titles have been distributed so far, which means that so many people have got the legitimate right to reside inside the forested region. Then we know that various schemes of the government of India, for example, skill development, which is Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and many other schemes dealing with the rural development have a special focus on LWE areas. Similarly, Ministry of Education keeps LWE areas on high priority. For example, recently 7 new Kendriya Vidyalayas and 6 new Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas have been opened in LWE affected areas. And you'll be surprised to know that out of these, 2 new Kendriya Vidyalayas are to be opened in Gadchiroli and Kondagaon, which are the epicenter of Naxalism. So this is as far as the steps taken by the central government. But there are various unique schemes being run by various state governments. There are some unique surrender policies being run by various state governments, which has led to rapid increase in the surrender by the Naxalites. Similarly, there are some dedicated police force being created to counter LWE. And so let us know in the comment section what can be some important case studies to be cited while writing an answer in the mains examination. So this discussion is very pertinent from the perspective of GS3 mains examination, and this discussion we understood the idea behind Naxalism, how it originated, what were the deficits in our legal framework which actually gave rise to the Naxalism, and then finally what has been the government approach to counter left-wing extremism. Jal Jeevan Mission to help revive urban water bodies appears on page number 10. So during her budget speech, Finance Minister announced Jal Jeevan Mission Urban, which has been designed to provide universal coverage of water supply to all households through functional taps in all 4,378 statutory towns in accordance with SDG Goal 6. Now in the comment section, let us know what is the criteria for a town to be declared as statutory and what is the SDG goal number 6. Now we all know that government has already launched Jal Jeevan Mission Rural, which has been able to cover only 34% of the targeted households in rural India, and the data has come from Union Ministry of Jal Shakti. Now let us first understand what is the need of such a scheme. And there is a need for such a scheme because 2.68 crore is the estimated gap in urban household tap connection that is proposed to be covered under this particular mission. Then also there is a gap in sewerage connections to the household as well. We know that India has around 16% of the world population, but only 4% of the fresh water resources. And so depleting groundwater levels, overexploitation and deteriorating water quality, climate change are major challenges to provide potable drinking water. We also know that World Health Organization has repeatedly stressed the importance of clean water, sanitation and clean environment as a prerequisite to achieving universal health. And so the Jal Jeevan Mission will help meet these goals. So what are the major reforms under the mission? And there are quite a few terms which the budget speech has used. First and foremost is the circular economy of water. This particular scheme will promote circular economy of water through development of city water balance plan for each city, focusing on recycle and reuse of treated sewage, rejuvenation of water bodies and water conservation. Then this particular scheme will ensure dual piping system. Now what is this dual piping system? Now you see, when we talk about reuse of sewage water, then of course we cannot gain that confidence to drink that water. And so dual piping is a system of plumbing which is used to supply both potable as well as reclaimed water to homes and businesses. And so one pipe will carry the clean drinking water, another pipe will carry water for other purposes, for example washing, and to be used in other house chores. Then it will help unlock value and improve land use efficiency through adequate urban planning. Then, as we have discussed, it talked about rejuvenation of water bodies to augment sustainable fresh water supply. It will venture into novel and cheaper technologies, and so it has announced a technology submission, so funds will be given for innovation as well. Then it has decided to come up with Pay Jal Sarvekshan or drinking water survey, which will be conducted in cities to ascertain equitable distribution of water is happening or not. Then it intends to promote PPP model. And in order to promote public-private partnership, it has been mandated for cities having more than 1 million population to take up PPP projects worth minimum of 10% of their total project fund allocation. Then it aims to raise funds through issuance of municipal bonds and rejuvenation of water bodies. And then finally, there is going to be a lot of emphasis on IEC campaigns or information, education and communication. And so let us now talk about the funding pattern of this particular scheme. As far as union territories are concerned, there will be 100% central funding. For northeastern and hill states, the central funding will be 90%. And for other states, central funding will be 50% for cities less than 1 lakh population, 1/3 for cities with 1 lakh to 10 lakh population, and 25% for cities with million plus population.